So, welcome everyone to the lecture on just transition. I'm already here with Kevin Grecksch, our guest from Oxford, United Kingdom. But I have a couple of remarks as an intro before we can start. I know Kevin now for about 1 year, and we met in a very interesting way. We both had the pleasure to select young scholars for a symposium in Berlin organized by the British Academy and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. So we could flip through these very promising and exciting CVs of music colleges and art colleges and whatever. And in June this year, we met all together in Berlin, and we had the chance to discuss with these scholars and scientists from the UK and from Germany how communities all over the world address the need for creative interventions in social and environmental crisis. So a topic closely related to the transformation. We were discussing 2 days in a very generous and informal way with them how communities in the future, today and in the past have managed or even failed to manage rapid social, natural and technological change. From this initial meeting, our common project Landscapes of Just Transition resulted. So the British Academy is funding Kevin here to be with us. So thanks to the British Academy at this point. And our collaboration intends an exchange of experiences, methods and knowledge with regard to socio-ecological transformation in Germany and the United Kingdom. As you can imagine, even if you're not an expert in this particular topic, socio-ecological transformations are big, complex and far-reaching processes of change that involve land and the society. East Germany here in particular faces the exit from lignite and the ecological and social sustainable development of post-mining landscapes. Ideally, this transition is done by the introduction of new industries with digital and sustainable technologies. But this is not an easy task at all for the people. Transition may also come, again, might people say here, with fear, resistance, social inequalities, and other social challenges. Therefore, we need strategies to enhance the acceptance for new social and ecological norms and techniques. An approach of just transfer, as we might say, is needed, and hopefully in our case here, secured by the Just Transition Fund of the European Union with the help of the state of Saxony-Anhalt. But money alone is not enough. We also need research and the impact of our research for the region. And this is where our European Center of Just Transition Research and Impact-Driven Transfer, the JTC, comes in. Together with 17 innovation groups, we do research about just sustainable and climate neutral transitions into the future. And the idea of transfer that we're using here is a two-way process between science, society, and business, in which scientific findings are translated into practical innovations in the region, and practical experiences are then again or at the same time examined in research. Of course, the JTC is a massive project. We have a lot of expertise here, but we cannot do this alone just here in Germany. We need a constant exchange with our international partners, and Kevin is one of them. So let me introduce in a couple of words Kevin. He's a department lecturer and course director for water science policy and management at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. Kevin is educated as a social scientist and now specialized in normative and analytical aspects of governance, especially with regard to water and climate change adaptation. His research interests include multi-level environmental governance, water governance, climate change adaptation, governance of societal transformation processes, property rights, and the governance of natural resources. Kevin has a particular interest why and how power relations, institutions, and knowledge shape these governance processes. But Kevin is also passionate about public engagement with research and his own research impact. For example, he organized two very successful drought walks in Birmingham and London. So what is a drought walk? Kevin was walking with stakeholders at places where droughts in the past happened and discussed with them the issues of drought and water scarcity. So this is a very good example to make these research topics tangible and to get in an exchange with stakeholders. But Kevin is not only an expert for water governance in the United Kingdom, he has also vast research experience of transition processes in Germany. At the University of Oldenburg, in particular the Center for Environmental and Sustainable Research, he was researching the governance of climate change adaptation in this region. And I'm sure we will learn about these processes and experiences a lot. So let me welcome with you in the name of the Institute of Geoscience and Geography, but also the Just Transition Center with its board members Jonathan Everts, Ralf Wersporn, and Christian Tietje. Let me welcome Kevin Grecksch for his lecture.
Okay,
the floor is yours, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So, let me just set the time as well. So we do this in English, but I'm German as well. No? Ich bin Deutsch auch, so I will understand you if you speak German. And I suppose everyone in the room speaks German. So if I throw in the occasional German word, you're probably fine with this. But it's just because we also cast this on the web. And to be honest, since I do all my research in English, it's sometimes a little easier for me to do this in English than in German because I struggle with some of the words. But anyway, we'll get there. So what I'm planning with you, and I've planned for roughly 45 minutes, I suppose, is to talk to you about like just transition. Just to give you a few reflections on the concept, its usefulness, some practical examples. I will involve you as well, so you're not just going to listen. I'll give you a little bit of theory because we need to set the context as well. And then I give you two examples. I'll give you one example from the UK, and I'll give you one from Germany. And then obviously, if there really is, I suppose we have reserved time at the very end for your questions and for discussions, but if there really is something where you're kind of like struggling to understand this at this very moment, just raise your hand, I suppose, and I can try to solve the issue. So kind of like the underlying, I got you through this already, so we will talk a little bit about like what is just transition, to what are we actually transitioning to? Do we actually know this? And why? What is needed for just transition? And then as I said, I'll give you some examples as well. But before this, let's do a little bit of an exercise. You will see a photograph in a second. Typically what I do with my students in Oxford is, and maybe I should say, so my background is in political science and English literature and economics, but I also spent 6 years in a law faculty. So you see I come at this from a very interdisciplinary perspective. No? So if you see me going on about governance in a few moments, that's just because I love it. No? So typically I take my students actually to the museum where you see what you will see in a second. I'll give you an impression of how it actually looks like in terms of dimensions. So you'll see a photograph of an object, and I want you to have a look at it and then describe it to me, have a little guess what it actually is. So here it is. It's about this in length, and the diameter is about like this. What could this be? You can say it in English or in German, it doesn't matter. Yeah, anyone?
It looks like a post hammer. You switch to those fences, like you lift it up and you throw down like a post.
Interesting. Yeah. Other ideas?
Is it hollow?
Yes, it's hollow. Yeah.
It's for containing water.
Cooling water. Yeah, okay. Good thought. Let's hear one more idea. Okay, so you were more in the right kind of like ballpark. It is indeed, it's a water pipe. It is it here? It's a water pipe from ancient Greece. Hollow. We'll talk in a moment why it has these 4 handles. So I want you to remember this. So we've established this is a water pipe. Show you another picture. You see, or you recognize the water pipe, but there will be other objects in that picture as well. And again, same question. Please describe to me what you are seeing there. So you can see the water pipe is here. But what are we seeing here? What are the other objects in this display?
Objects to store water.
Yeah, for example, yeah. Yeah, you have these beautiful like ornamented vases or vessels. What could this be here? What does it look like? Fountain. Oh, I've never had this before. Yeah. It's a throne. Not a well, I had people guessing that this is a toilet as well. So you see, there's a throne, and there are these beautiful ornamented like vases. They use them for water, they use them for grains, for olive oil. So what's the humble water pipe doing in there? Why, if you have all of these important objects, why would you put a simple kind of like water pipe in there? What does that mean for water? Well, it simply means that water means power. So this is from the temple of Knossos, on the island of Crete. If you are the ruler of that temple or that city, you are able to get, first of all, fresh water inside the temple. And then even more important, get that wastewater, that dirty water outside. You maintain hygienic conditions. And this is what you need, because then you can prevent diseases and other things. So water means power. All I'm trying to say to you here is that always look at that bigger picture. We can talk the whole day about that water pipe. Why it has these 4 handles. Probably because obviously today we put water pipes underground. No, we don't see them typically. But back then we didn't have the technology. So maybe you could carry them, because you could see that this is kind of like what you see here. It's kind of like an adapter, so you could stack them like one after another. And you would probably lead them out of the city into what's called a cesspool. Once that is full, you could just probably carry it somewhere else. But these are assumptions. We don't actually know. But the idea really is just to look at context. And I think that's an important message as well, and maybe an underlying message for the rest of what you're going to hear in this presentation. So let me make some opening remarks as well. So transformations or transitions are actually nothing new. We've always been, or we're constantly transforming, transitioning, whether it's small part, whether it's whole societies, whether it's whole countries. I mean, we all live in a country that's transformed itself many times, and it's actually very young history as a German nation. And we already had, if we focus a little bit more into environmental policy, we have already seen actually successful transitions. I'm sure you all know what the European Union is. There is environmental policy within the European Union. Well, for a very long time, until probably the mid-80s, European environmental policy was shaped by German and French style kind of like policy making. And that meant command and control. Do this, don't do that. If you do this, if you pollute that water body, you pay a fine. Command and control. That's what Germans and French policymakers used to love. But then a country entered the European Union, or what was back then the European Community, in 1974. It left it again a couple of years ago, the United Kingdom. And this is one of the ironies of Brexit. European Union environmental policy wouldn't be what it is today without the United Kingdom. They brought such a pragmatic approach to environmental policy where we profit today from it. Now we have all these framework directives. Water Framework Directive, we have the Habitats Directive, and so on and so on. This idea of just providing a framework, but then translating it into national context, respecting national policy making as well. This all goes down to the British. So we had kind of like these successes. We had, until the late 70s, early 80s, there were no environment ministries in liberal democracies. They just didn't exist. And then actually the UK had the first environment ministry in the early 80s. What definitely made lots of countries think about environment, more about the environment, was 1986, 26th of April, Chernobyl. That changed a lot in terms of policy making and transformed a lot as well. But when we look a little bit of our current problems, and probably the one we talk most about these days is like climatic changes or bigger environmental changes, success is very limited so far. And why is that so? First of all, there are path dependencies and lock-ins. Lots of countries have locked themselves in, and it takes decades, if not longer, to get out of certain policies. I'll give you the example from the UK. The UK decided probably 10 years ago, we're going to invest again in nuclear energy. So they're building at least 2 new nuclear power plants. That means you need 5, 6, 7, probably 10 years to build these things. You then run them for 50, 60 years, and then you need to decommission them, and you need to store that nuclear waste. So that locks you in a certain type of energy policy for probably at least 100 years. And you can't get out of there. It's really difficult. There's obviously a lack of enforcement as well. Just look at things like the Paris Agreement. This is international law, that's soft law as well. We can't put another state into a prison. That's impossible. So we have that lack of enforcement. I would also say we're not really trying hard enough. We could do a lot more. And then this is maybe a little provocative. We kind of like trust as well the same institutions that are at least partially responsible for our current situation with finding solutions. So I would argue that we need to be a little bit more open-minded, allow ourselves more what's called blue sky thinking, we need to listen more, and we need to build trust as well. So focusing a little more into the topic, so just transitions to what and why. I think the answer to the why is very easy. We don't need to discuss this. We all know why we're here. But to what actually? I would hypothesize there's not actually a consensus to what we are actually transitioning to. Is it that we want more green growth, which to me is an oxymoron? These two things, in my opinion, don't actually go together. Is it more like a bioeconomy? Is it sustainable development? Well, then the SDGs, we have another, 5.5 years for the SDGs? Are we going to reach them? Probably not. What comes after them? Things like circular economy, degrowth, low carbon, net zero, etc. You've heard all of this. As I said, I would argue there isn't actually a consensus to what of these options are we going to go for? Or is it maybe a mixture of them? Do we need to actually agree on one of these? So there's little consensus actually on these things. There is, as I mentioned before already, a lack of political will. And then we also need to talk, of course, about societal acceptance and participation. For those of us who work on these topics, for us, this is like pretty clear where the direction is going. What we want, we are convinced of this. We know there are hundreds of papers, of books, book chapters, working papers, etc., that say, yes, this is what we need to do. This is where we need to transition to. But is there actually societal acceptance for this? Do the people actually want this? Do they want something different? Do they want to stay things the same? So these are interesting questions. I focus in a little more on like two aspects, and this is based on a review I did with a colleague a couple of years ago. So the first thing is about like access. Right? If we want to have just transitions, one of the big questions is, how can we access, or do we have access to basic needs and basic rights? Access to basic needs, there's a strong link to the concept of vulnerability. So whether we are, well, you could say it's the capacity to be harmed. You have maybe seen this before. There's a standard like IPCC definition of exposition plus sensitivity plus adaptive capacity equals vulnerability, basically. Translated into, if you live at the North Sea coast, there's sea level rise, your house is very close to the coast, well, you probably have vulnerability. You live in the Bavarian Alps, sea level rise isn't really so interesting for you, but there will be other things. But we need to remember as well that vulnerability is politically constructed as well. We can make up vulnerabilities, we can stress them, we can also say, no, we are not vulnerable. Then typically we link vulnerability to natural hazards, so whatever, urban heat islands, heavy rainfall, sea level rise, storm floods, these kind of things. But I think what's becoming more and more clear is that there are underlying like socioeconomic drivers as well. And I think we've seen this during the pandemic, how unequal we actually are as societies in the West. I did a review for the British Academy as well, where I looked at how different parts of the population had access to water during the pandemic, because one of the big messages that we were told in the UK was always, go outside, use your hour that you can go outside every day, walk along a river, canal, go to your local park. But it turned out that it's like well-off, white, middle-class people who actually have access. But then people, black people, Asian people, people from the Middle East, it turns out they live in apartments further away from water bodies. So they're kind of like structural inequalities as well. And the access to basic rights. So basic rights, that's like the right to housing, the right to education, the right to water as well. So these are kind of like basic rights, and they're obviously threatened as well by these big changes. And I'm sure you've heard about like the small island and development states. Well, sea level is rising, maybe they have to move somewhere else. But what if they can't move? What if they're trapped? These so-called trapped populations. Maybe they can't afford to relocate to another place. And maybe they don't want to, because this is their ancestral home. And you can probably see this as well in some of these former or in these still existing mining areas, whether it's here, whether it's in Lausitz, or whether it's in the Rhineland, like west of Cologne. People are resisting as well. They don't want to leave their houses as well. That's a form of voluntary immobility as well. And then a big one is obviously access to decision making. There are huge kind of like imbalances here. It's uneven at all levels. I mean, we just had the COP negotiations in Azerbaijan a couple of weeks ago, when you see like which of the stakeholders are represented, which are not, who has access to whom, and so on and so on. And we also need to be clear that with any kind of transition process, there will be losers as well. Not everyone can win. That's for sure. And then another one is, of course, transformation will cost us money. Where's that money going to come from? Who's going to pay for this? What if you transition and then it's not successful? Accountability as well in terms of the money spent. So these are also things. Then just a couple of words regarding like methods that could make us help, because obviously transformation, transitions are things where we look into the future. It's not happening right now, but it's going to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and so on. So for example, a useful method is scenario building, where you ask not what should happen, but maybe what can happen as well, because that allows us to think about alternative futures. once you have scenarios, you can decide for one, and then you can do what's called like backcasting. So you go back to today, and then you make a plan for what you do in order to reach that scenario. Vision building. I know we had a chancellor in this country who said, wer Visionen hat, soll zum Arzt gehen. Helmut Schmidt. But I'll come back to him in a few moments, and maybe he should have gone to a doctor before, as you will see. But they can be extremely helpful, because we need to allow ourselves as well to kind of like creative ways of thinking about the future. Then it's all kind of like, and you've maybe come across this, the whole items of like citizen assemblies, citizen science. So have you heard about citizen assemblies? So the idea that you select a representative sample of the population on a given topic, and you debate it over a couple of weeks or months, and then you come up with a report and with recommendations for policy making. The UK had a very successful citizen assembly on climate change. Probably the poster child for citizen assemblies is now the Republic of Ireland. They had a very important citizen assembly on abortion rights a couple of years ago, where they then essentially changed the law. And then the whole thing of like citizen science, co-creation. So the idea that typically when we sit in our offices here as researchers, we come up with the research questions. But why don't we ask the people that we are researching what they actually want? What questions do they have? Can we maybe answer different types of questions? But all of these kind of like participatory processes are very nice, they're very good, they're very important, but it should not be an excuse for government inaction as well. They still have to act. Okay, a little bit more theory. Sorry. But just kind of like, again, to set the scene a little bit. So as I said, I'm a political scientist, and my expertise is in governance. So I could probably talk 2 hours here about this, but I won't, don't worry. But I will talk a little bit about governance. But I would like to mention as well 2 other concepts where maybe some governance scholars would say they fall under governance. So this is like transition management, and the other one is this is more like Bielefeld, sociology, Niklas Luhmann, and then, so this is Hartmut Wilke, dezentrale Kontextsteuerung, contextual guidance. I'll get into this very briefly. Before I go a little bit into detail with reflexive governance. So transition management, and these are just 2 kind of like, it's the wrong year, obviously. It's supposed to be parenthesis. Is an idea that was developed in the Netherlands. So the idea behind transition management is that it's kind of like a deliberative attempt to stimulate the transition towards a more sustainable future. So you create these so-called transition arenas where you where you gather like different stakeholders, and you try to come to a viable solution for a transition. It's a very rigid method, and that's also the critique, because it's not very flexible. But with the kind of problems that we're dealing and why we want a transition or a transformation, we have to deal with uncertainty, with a lot of uncertainty. So this is kind of like a little bit working against this. And then the actual kind of like empirical evidence from these transition management processes was that huge power balances that we already have in societies have just been reflected and mirrored in these transition arenas. So the example that you will find in the literature is the transition arena on energy transition in the Netherlands, which was just dominated by the CEO of Royal Dutch Shell, so one of the biggest fossil fuel companies on this planet. So nothing actually changed, basically. And then contextual guidance. So this idea, and you'll see in a second that this is like Luhmann systems theory. So the idea that our modern world, our modern societies are just complex, very complex. And we are also very functionally differentiated. We have law as a system. We have universities as a system. There's schools, everything. You have all these different kind of like subsystems. And the idea here is just to say, okay, there's no point actually in trying to steer or govern this process like centrally, but just accept that this isn't possible, but maybe develop some sort of like very light touch kind of like overall framework or vision, but then let the individual subsystems kind of like do their own work, so to speak. But you don't need a central actor. That's basically the underlying message. But it's just a couple of words on governance. It's one of these terms, obviously, that's very difficult to define. It shares this fate with like sustainability, resilience, and others. You'll find lots of different definitions. It's very fuzzy. It's what some scholars as well say. These are like container terms. They're empty. You just fill them with a meaning that you need. So I wasn't happy. So I came up with my own one as well. On governance. So steering mechanism, new modes of coordination, regulation, cooperation, and management, the multiple levels, different actors, but making binding political decisions. So I didn't come up, obviously, with governance. You can trace this back probably mid-90s, maybe even a little earlier. It's just that kind of like shift from a top-down model of governing to a more kind of like bottom-up approach. So this idea that there's not the all-knowing like state that knows everything better, and yes, we have our specialist like people in our ministries and they make the right decisions. No, but it's this idea really of just opening up that decision-making process, saying, okay, we get other stakeholders on board, thereby we are legitimizing as well, and we empower non-state actors. And we can also kind of like be more flexible in our negotiations and mechanisms. But again, it's not a withdrawal of the state. In political science, you say the state is still primus inter pares, so you're still the first among others. And that's very important, because the state still holds the rule of law, taxation, and the right to violence. So these are three important things that the state will not give up in the near future, and probably also not in the long-term future. I just highlight the last one. So reflexive governance is just kind of like one iteration of governance. There are many more. But what the literature tells us is that reflexive governance might be suitable for long-term changes or transitions because they are characterized by uncertainty and complexity. So the idea of reflexive governance is to say, okay, here's all the knowledge that we have. We decide a policy, but then maybe every couple of years, when we have new evidence, we sit together again and we can renegotiate and we can adapt. That's kind of like the reflexivity. So instead of saying, okay, here's a policy, this is what we're going to do until maybe a new government decides to change that policy or the law. No. So you go into kind of like constant kind of like feedback loops, which are reflexive. Okay, enough of the theory, examples. Good. So as I said, I'd like to give you two examples, one from England and one from Germany. One word on, when I say England, I really mean England. I'm saying this, I'm stressing this because we use UK, we say Britain, we say England, but these are not the same things. So the UK, the United Kingdom, that's 4 constituent nations. That's Northern Ireland, that's Scotland, that's Wales, and that's England. And they are very different, believe me. Lived there for 10 years. They're very different in terms of, for example, Scotland has a completely different legal system than England. And so on, and I could go on. And that's really important because regulations, policy are very different in these 4 constituent parts. So here I'm talking about the idea of fracking in England. I'm sure you've heard about fracking before. So the other, what you see is, what's it called? Correctly you say hydrological fracturing. Because the idea is you go down where you know that in your geological layer, in your rock layer, there's gas trapped in the porous rocks. You inject a mixture of water and chemicals, and thereby kind of like you fracture that layer of rock. The gases that are trapped are released. You capture them and they come up basically above ground, and then you turn them into like electricity. So what was the idea? Why is this a transformation? So the idea was, obviously the UK, as many other countries, needs to transition to a different type of like energy supply. So the idea, and we're talking here maybe the year starting 2010, maybe 2012, the then government in the UK said, okay, we want to become the shale gas leader of the world. Shale gas is just another word for this type of fuel. So they just set up this policy that no matter what, we want to transition. Why? Because the government's own kind of like research body, which is the British Geological Survey, so that's like your Bundesamt für Geowesen, something like this. They produced a report saying there's a lot of potential for fracking in England. But it's actually a very good example of how not to do a transition, because it backfired spectacularly. Because they did basically everything wrong that you could do wrong. So we actually have a moratorium on fracking in the UK or in England. It's actually applicable for the whole of the UK, not just England, since 2019. So what was happening? There was never at any point, any commercial exploration of shale gas in England. These were all just test drilling sites. So there were 3 test drilling sites in the north of England and 1 in the south of England. And then earthquakes happened at these test drilling sites. So they stopped it. There's a moratorium. Moratorium means it's not prohibited, but you can't do it at the moment. But basically, if the government decides, yes, we want to pursue this again, they could end this moratorium and you could go back to basically the situation before the moratorium. Then the same report by the British Geological Survey that said, yes, there's a huge potential for shale gas in the UK. That report also said, like, don't do it because it may contaminate groundwater. But they just ignored it, basically, because they were so interested in pushing this technology. I say this against the background that typically there is this stereotype of the wet country. Like it always rains in England. Well, let me tell you, it doesn't. At the moment, in England, we use 14 billion liters of water every day. By 2050, we will need an additional 5 billion liters of water per day. That's an unimaginable amount of water. Where's that going to come from? And should you really do fracking if there is potential harm to your groundwater sources? Maybe not. But that's kind of like just my assessment here as well. So what they basically did, let me go to this one first maybe. So what they basically did is they used a legal concept, and I'll explain this in a second, where they changed the things that they needed to change to make it happen, and the ones that were already useful to them, they just kept them. So they did basically 3 big things. So one is a new tax regime. So any geologists in the room? If you drill, that costs you a lot of money. It's expensive to drill down into the earth. So you needed to find something that attracts these companies to have these test drilling sites. So they reduced the tax on profits from 62 to 30%. That's quite generous. They also made changes to the planning process. There's no need to notify individual landowners, and they reduced the planning application fee. For context, England has a completely different legal system. It's called common law. Under common law, if you own a property, I know that, but don't worry, I'll do this. Here's your house. Here's the boundary of your property. The common law rule is everything to the center of the earth belongs to you. Doesn't make any sense. you'd be crushed by the weight of the earth. But anyway, it used to be as well up to the sky. But they qualified this very early on because obviously otherwise every time an aeroplane crosses over your property, they would need to ask for your permission. And that's just ridiculous, obviously. But it had never been actually qualified for below ground. In many other countries, it stops maybe at 3 meters, 6 meters, 9 meters, or 50 meters or so. It's quite random across the world. But anyway, so remember, fracking. You go down, and you go this. So obviously here's another house and so on. So you would need to ask every property owner for their permission. So in the first time for probably a couple of 100 years, they made changes to what's called the Infrastructure Act, and it's now limited to 300 meters. So if there's something below 300 meters, you don't need the permission of the landowner. So it's no longer to the center of the earth, it now stops at 300 meters. That's a big change for property law in England. The other thing about like planning, what you need to know as context is that it's a very fragmented country. So in England, it's a very centralized country. You think maybe France is centralized? No. Come to the UK, please. No, that's a good lesson in like over centralization, basically. That means, and you don't have a like intermediate level like we have here, the Bundesländer. No, they don't exist in the UK. It's different, yes, if you would look at Northern Ireland and so on, but that's a whole completely different process. But that means planning is a local matter. So every county, every Landkreis decides on their planning policy. There's no coordination because in England you don't have a like Landesraumplan or Regionaler Raumplan. It just doesn't exist, basically. Every county decides, oh, this is going to be a zone for industry, this one's going to be for housing, and so on, and there's no coordination among them. The other thing is that, and this is why I stress the centralization, if the government feels there's a process where there isn't enough progress, they can just declare any project as a project of national significance or importance. And thereby they can kind of like bypass any local planning consent. And that's what they try to do here as well. And they're constantly doing this. One of the biggest like infrastructure projects at the moment in England is they're building a high-speed railway line between London and Birmingham. It's supposed to go even to Manchester, but that's probably never going to happen. So basically, planning needed to happen. So obviously, you can imagine a railway line that crosses all of these different like counties. So every county needed to make like planning decisions. But basically, the central government said like, no, this is never going to happen if we have to do this. So they declared it as a matter of national importance, and that was it basically. You can bypass any kind of like participatory methods, any public consultation, nothing. They just do it basically. It's very authoritarian actually. So this had a big impact here as well. There were protests as well against these fracking sites. So people are not blocking the entrance so that no lorries could get out, lorries could get in, to the extent that some of these fracking companies decided to apply for so-called, sorry for getting a little legal here, they're so-called preemptive injunctions. So does anyone remember the movie Minority Report? That's basically like it. You're assuming that someone will commit a crime in the future, but you don't know that you are going to commit that crime. So practically by just walking next to that site, they could accuse you of being a protester. Obviously, it took a couple of days and the Supreme Court overthrew this because it's obvious it's legal nonsense. It just doesn't make any sense. So this is a really good example of how not to do these transformation processes because we are nowhere basically with this. And also there's a survey, an annual survey by the business or the Ministry like for Business and Industrial Strategy, where they asked people about like different like forms of energy and what they would like in the future, and no one says that they want fracking. So there's lots of things they went against, and it just didn't work out. Okay, let's move across the channel. Let's talk a little bit about like this is a completely different flavor of what I will give you now on this and angle. So this is more about like regional identity, it's about like historic, or the question basically, or the underlying question is, what is the role of historic narrative myths and human behavior in times of climate change? So we've looked, and I worked with a historian here, on Northern Europe's coastline, so basically the North Sea coast. We found this interesting as a topic because typically we rely on our scientific knowledge that we generate. And we think this is kind of like if you would make a hierarchy of like types of different like knowledges, we would probably, or we could agree, yes, because we're trying to be as objective as possible when we're collecting data in the field, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. But what about like local knowledge? What about local expert knowledge? What about anecdotes? No? What about like the cultural products that we produce? No? So we were really interested in like things that we find represented in fiction, in poems, in songs, in legends, because obviously these are cultural expressions as well. So we chose two concepts, regional and identity. And I mean, in a room full of geography students and academics, we can probably argue a whole day what regional actually means. Try to define what regional means. Now, I could probably give you 10 different examples of how you could use that term. And the second one is obviously identity. I mean, that's a word we like to throw around a lot these days. The whole US election was about identity, and probably the German election will, at least to some parts, also be about identity, whatever that is. But it is obviously an interesting a concept, and we've seen that it was used in all European nation-building processes in the last 200 years, kind of like to form kind of like a common identity, and often based on myths and legends. In France, it's Jeanne d'Arc, that figure, and she's used by the political left and by the political right, which is also very interesting. And you'll find examples everywhere, basically. When we also thought that if you look at the literature on how people identify and then their attitudes towards like climatic changes, this is often at a very like individual level. What do you think about like climate change? Would you change your behavior, etc.? But we said we're not really interested in this, and there are already lots of studies on this. But we thought, isn't it more interesting to look at group identity, or what we call like regional identity? So how people in a certain area self-identify with regard to the weather and climate as well. And how has this been shaped in the past and maybe will be shaped in the future? So the area that we've looked at is, let's do it this way. Maybe you remember this from your German lessons in school. So this is Faust 2, Goethe. And there you see, this is from 1832, and you see how this is expressed in literature already. I only read out the red parts. So my last and greatest act of will succeeds when that foul pool is the sea, the North Sea is gone. Let me make room for many a million, not wholly secure, but free to work on green, fertile fields where men and herds may gain swift comfort from the new-made earth, and so on and so on. And then that last line, now I savor it, that highest moment. So basically what he's telling us is that constant fight against nature. And what they did basically, because the area we are talking about is here, so it's that kind of like, here, Ostfriesland, East Frisia. Over 1,000 years ago, no one was able to live there. This was uninhabitable. But then people starting having these little ditches. They started building little dikes. So gradually, people were able to live there. So this is what he's kind of like referring in this. And I could give you other examples. You probably all know Schimmelreiter, Theodor Storm, Rider in the Storm in English. And Heinrich Heine has written poems about this, and so on. There's a very long list. And there's also very modern literature and songs about these phenomena. So what we found out, as I said, we've looked at the whole North Sea region, but we looked a little bit at the Baltic Sea as well. So first of all, one of the things is that building dikes to protect against storm floods, that's the kind of like raison d'etre of the area. No? This is how people identify themselves. And this is very interesting and very important because for the last 1,000 years, the dikes have grown in height, no? And the kind of like space they take away. And there was always technology involved, no? A lot. So for the people who live in this area, the protection against storm floods is as well a story of technological advancement. So if you suggest them now anything that goes like building back dikes, opening up, that's just seen as a step backwards, and you're not successful because it's so ingrained that it's all about technology, engineering, etc. That is kind of like the big story. The other interesting thing we realized is it doesn't matter if you look at the German North Sea coast or parts of the Baltic Sea, Denmark, or the Dutch, or even the Belgian and the East English coast. We found the same narratives everywhere. So this narrative of people living a sinful life. No? So whatever they were celebrating, one in the village or in the town, he got drunk, they didn't pay attention to the dike, the storm flood was coming in, the dike broke, the town was flooded, people died, and this was declared, okay, because you lived a sinful life, so it's an act of God, basically. You know? And it's very interesting that you find this story at various places. It's the similar kind of like narrative, which is kind of like really interesting. And then, this is number 4 here, and these kind of like narratives, they can have a positive effect as well because it helps us remember things as well. No, I mentioned Helmut Schmidt before. No? So he was the mayor of Hamburg, no, in 1962, and he misjudged the situation completely. He said, no, we're going to be fine. No? So no vision. No? And then that part of Hamburg got flooded, and I think a couple of hundred people died. No? But this is 1962. This is kind of like still the big one in the North Sea area. No? If you want a more local example, I remember when I was in my second year at university in Leipzig, we had these big floods on the Elbe, no? And all these tributaries. So that was, what was that, 2002, 2003 or so, I don't remember it. And I remember all this talk like, no, we're never going to build in floodplains again and so on. No, and I guarantee you that we've built on those floodplains again. No? Because we just forget these things as well. No? If we don't pass on this, yeah, I'll come to an end in a second as well. So this is the area again. Here you see what also works as good, remember, are these flood markers. No? So you can see here that you find these at houses, but you find this along rivers everywhere as well. No? Which one? This one is from 1872. No? This one is from, I can never read this. No? It's older. Basically, no? It's a constant kind of like reminder of the threat that the sea is. No? So we've looked actually, so how can we make changes in these areas if people are so self-assured of their identity, no, and don't want to bring about any changes? So we found one study by colleagues, or actually very close colleagues, who did in a very small part of that area, they worked on like what they call like collaborative landscape planning. So they worked with different stakeholders in this community, and they came up with these 4 scenarios, and then they were asked like, which one is your favorite one? And they decided for this one, for D, which is kind of like a couple of like polder or retention areas, improving the drainage system, etc. But then the stuff I highlighted is interesting here. They said it was important to all stakeholders to maintain the landscape's aesthetic like values, that cultural services, among them community identification, were seen as essential. No? So there's your element of identity. No? You can bring about changes as long as it corresponds with the identity of the people. No? And that's very interesting, and I think something maybe we can work with as well when we are transforming places, no? or whole systems. No? So that means integration. No? How can we do this? By integrating local knowledge. I mentioned this now a couple of times. there are different types of knowledges. No? The knowledge that lay people's knowledge, expert knowledge, local expert knowledge, knowledge that we produce in academia. We can combine all of these different types of knowledges. And I think, maybe speaking to the last bullet point here, is we need to get rid of that notion that traditional knowledge only exists in the global south. We have traditional knowledge as well. But we've forgotten about most of it because we live in such a kind of like advanced society that we rely on technology and academic knowledge that we kind of like forgot about it. No? But it's still there, no? And people have that knowledge. It's just a way of kind of like sharing this. Okay, I leave this out. We can talk about this later if this is maybe interesting. Let me just make a kind of like overall kind of like summary or conclusion. So, I think at the very beginning I said like we still probably need a consensus on what just transition actually is. No? So what are we actually transitioning to? Are we sure about this? We need to make sure kind of like to be open-minded, respect rights and participation. There needs to be an equal distribution as well of the burden of transition. And then maybe a last point as well, just we have a lot of knowledge, we have a lot of routines that we use, but transition means we also need to get rid of a lot of knowledge and forget about it. And that's harder than you think. Okay, thank you very much.